Thank you, Kevin. Hi, John. Actually, Phil asked my question, but...
Oh, good. So we can go to the next one.
No, I have a follow-up on that. You know, the expectation that these tanks will be delivered within a month, at least for a month. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. But also the reports that the Russians might launch a counterattack now. Do you see this as a catalyst for the Russians now to launch an attack, to escalate the war in a way to stop them before they receive these tanks? If they're going to make any change in the war.
I never do well if I try to speak for the Russians and try to get inside their head and what their intents are. What we do believe, all I can tell you is what we believe, and that is that the Russians, Mr. Putin, will use the winter not only to conduct operations, which he is in Bakhmut and Soledar, but to use it to regroup, to retrain, to re-equip, and to prepare himself for continued fighting when the weather improves. So we want to make sure that we're using this time as best we can. A, to help the Ukrainians in the fight that they're in today, but make sure that they're ready for the fight tomorrow, that they're ready to defend themselves against whatever offensive operations the Russians might be planning to do when the weather improves. So again, I can't predict perfectly how this is going to go, but this is very much, you know, some of the criticism I've heard, and I've heard it when I was at the Pentagon too, is, you know, it's hand to mouth, and you guys aren't thinking ahead, and it's just whatever the need is for today. And this decision today is very much indicative of the president's long-term commitment to Ukraine and how he has tasked the national security team to think ahead, to plan ahead, to help the Ukrainians get ahead of what's coming down the pike.
Can I follow up on that?
Two quick follow-ups. You noted that our military aid to Ukraine has evolved with conditions on the ground, and the president previously said that these M1 Abrams were needed to liberate Ukraine. Does the administration expect any operations moving forward that would include retaking Crimea or lands that were lost during the Russian invasion?
I'm not going to talk about Ukrainian operations. I would just never violate their operational security, and certainly wouldn't divulge from the podium what their plans and intentions are. I will only say this, that we do not dictate to the Ukrainians how they operate, where they operate, what missions they conduct, what targets they choose. We help them with usable information and intelligence as best we can so that they can be successful, but these are their decisions to make. It is their country, their war. Our job is to make sure that they can prosecute that war successfully.
And I want to follow up to make sure that I understood you correctly. You said previously in your assessment of both military and economic aid to Ukraine that at this point, thus far, you haven't seen any signs of corruption or misuse?
Correct.
Thanks, John. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the U.S. settled on the number of tanks it's providing, 31? That's a very specific number.
I kind of got to it a little earlier. It's basically the size of a Ukrainian tank battalion. In America, and I'm getting a little bit astray of my knowledge. I was a naval officer, but as I understand it, an American tank battalion has about 50 tanks in it, and it's organized with more companies to comprise a battalion than in Ukraine. It's just the way the Ukrainian army is organized. It's not right or wrong. It's just that their battalions are basically, I believe, 2 companies. So they're just smaller. And so 2 companies, that's about 15 tanks a company, and that's how you get to 30, 31. And then, you know, usually at least one of these tanks is the commander's in there, and so you've got a command and control tank that sort of is in charge of how they're operating on the field. And now I'm really, really going astray of my expertise. But I think that's about as far as I can go.
The Ukrainians said today, thank you very much. Now how about some 4th-generation fighter jets? What are the chances of that happening?
We're in constant discussions with the Ukrainians about their capabilities. And as I've said, we evolve those as the conditions change. Can't blame the Ukrainians for wanting more and more systems. It's not the first time that they've talked about fighter jets, but I don't have any announcements to make on that front.
Go ahead, Christina.
Is there concern that if any of these tanks were to fall in Russian hands, they would have access to the latest U.S. technology?
There's always what we call tech transfer concerns, I mean, that would be the case with other systems that we have provided to Ukraine. But, and this kind of gets to the corruption question, but not really. We just haven't seen any indications that any of the material that we have provided Ukraine isn't being stored appropriately, used appropriately, maintained appropriately, and being fought with appropriately. We're just not seeing that happen. But is that a potential risk? It's always a risk in war. It's a risk when we fight a war. But that's why we're working so closely with the Ukrainians on accountability, and we've really increased our efforts through the Defense Attaché's office in Kyiv to work with the Ukrainians on accountability, so that we have a better sight picture on where these things are at any given time. But it's a war, and you can't forget that. I mean, it's a war.
Thanks.